Again, the Ritchie Boys, Jewish GIs in the fight against anti-Semitism. My name's on the bottom there. My name's David Backer. I'm an education associate at the Zuckerman Holocaust Center. I have bachelor's degrees in history and political science from Wayne State University. I'm also working on a master's degree in World War II studies. And because it's kind of pertinent to the presentation we'll be going over today, I'm also an Army veteran from 2016 to 2019. Thank you. From 2016 to 2019, I was an active duty military police officer. That's my bio. My colleague Alex will be delivering the second half of the presentation.
Yeah.
Deliver your bio.
So my name's Alex Tomaszewski. I'm a colleague of David's at the Zuckerman Holocaust Center. I also have a background in history. I have a bachelor's in history and a minor in archaeology. Although I didn't serve with any services, both my little brother and my brother-in-law both one did a tour in Afghanistan and the other one did a tour, not a tour, but he was stationed in Okinawa and areas of the Philippines. So while I didn't serve, I do come from a family that does have a military background.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
And then this picture right here is, well, I was going to say it's of the museum. It's more like the front entrance of our museum. Can I get a show of hands who's actually been to the Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills? Okay, about half. Have you all been recently? Somewhat recently. Well, in January of 2024, we did launch our brand new exhibit. It is state of the art. I, of course, maybe a little bit partial because I work there, but I think of all the Holocaust museums in the US, I genuinely think that we do a very good job. It's 20,000 square foot exhibit. Again, it was just installed in January of 2024. And over the course of a year, we see about 100,000 people come through the doors here at the Holocaust Center. If you haven't been, I definitely recommend stopping by. It's important, I think, before we kind of get into the Ritchie Boys to define our terms. So what was the Holocaust? At the Zuckerman Holocaust Center, we define the Holocaust as the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and mass murder of over 6 million European Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between the years 1933 and 1945. Now, the Holocaust, it was a genocide in which Jewish people were targeted for extermination simply because they were Jewish. The image that's on this slide comes from what's called the Auschwitz album, and it shows the arrival of Hungarian Jewish people at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the notorious concentration and death camp. Now, it's important to remember that while these mass exterminations of Jewish people are taking place across Germany, Poland, and the rest of Eastern Europe, World War II is actually still going on, right? The Allies, including the United States, fight to defeat the Nazis and ultimately to end this genocide. For the Nazis, however, I think we need to think of World War II not only as this total war against the Allies, but also this total war against Jewish people. So today we're going to be learning stories of a select group of US military service members who were nicknamed the Ritchie Boys, and they played a very key role in collecting intelligence to beat the Nazis on the battlefield during World War II. For them, their motivation to serve for America and its allies, they had a motivation to serve on behalf of America and the Allies, but also they had this motivation for themselves, being that they were German Jewish people. The enemy that they were fighting was very, very close and personal. At the Holocaust Center, we like to teach the human story. So throughout this presentation today, we're going to be hearing clips from survivors / Ritchie Boys and exploring artifacts from our museum's collection as well to give you a sense of how this history impacted real people on an individual level. Anybody have any questions so far? So I want to begin by introducing you to one Ritchie boy, a guy by the name of Guy Stern. And for actually many, many years, he actually worked at the Zuckerman Holocaust Center. He was born in the town of Hildesheim, Germany, and he grew up as the Nazis were rising to power and anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred was spreading rapidly in his home country. He was the only member of his family to escape Nazi Germany and come to the US in 1937. And he was actually drafted into the army in 1943. Now, originally, Guy was turned away from military service as a result of his German and Jewish identity. He actually, as soon as he graduated high school, went to enlist in the Navy, specifically in naval intelligence. But because he was not yet a citizen, he technically was classified as an enemy of the state, being German. But of course, he was drafted, as I said, in 1943 into the army. And once he was in the military, he became a naturalized citizen and was then told he was being transferred to, at the time, what was a top secret camp called Camp Ritchie. At Ritchie, he was trained in military intelligence and he was later deployed to Europe. During the war, Guy could not separate his experiences as an American soldier from his experiences as a German-born. This quote comes from his memoir that's called Invisible Ink. He says, "As for me, not only did I share the anxieties of the soldiers all around me, I had a few special ones of my own too. Naturally, I painted a bleak picture of my future if the Germans were to capture me, a German-born Jew. In fact, many Jewish American soldiers are struggling with how to hide their identities. Guy is going to be naturalized after completing basic training. He goes with several other German Jewish immigrants, and they're actually given the option to change their names so that if they're captured, it makes them less identifiable if they have more Jewish sounding names, let's say. A lot of these soldiers also struggle with whether or not to hide their dog tags, which at the time are going to be marked with an H for Hebrew, in case they, of course, were taken as prisoners of war. But not only did Guy have normal fears like his comrades about war, but he also had to consider his dangerous position as a Jew who was targeted for extermination by the Nazis during this genocide. This was a danger that he and many other Jewish GIs deployed to Europe faced on a daily basis during the war. For many, they were willing to face these risks in order to fight Nazi anti-Semitism. Acts of resistance took many different forms during the Holocaust. For some, combating anti-Semitism meant putting on a uniform. Over 500,000 Jewish Americans served during World War II. They were officers and enlisted, Army and Navy, rear echelon, and combat troops. They fought both for America and against anti-Semitism, and believed that Nazi ideology was fundamentally opposed to American values. This is a wall that's in our exhibit. It's actually kind of right at the end of our exhibit that shows some of the fallen Jewish war veterans from our home state of Michigan who lost their lives serving during World War II. This memorial exists because we cannot forget their stories and sacrifices and the unique challenges that they faced. I do have to say this was put together by the Michigan Jewish Veterans Organization / Alliance. They put this together while the Korean War was taking place. So it's not entirely accurate to say that these are all deceased World War II veterans. Excuse me. There are some Korean Jewish veterans that kind of snuck out of the wall.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why would they mark the dog tag with an H?
So Christians too were marked. Way would say Christian.
Oh,
Yeah, it's a thing. It's something that's actually still done now to this day. Soldiers, those who don't have tags, they're relatively it's an option. You don't have a good question. No, thank you. Deborah Dash Moore is an author and historian who has extensively studied the experiences of American Jewish GIs in World War II. She had to say about the challenges that these service members faced. She said, first, they would have to prove their presence at the front. Then they would have to demonstrate their competence in battle. They would have to earn the respect that was more commonplace among other American soldiers. Despite their patriotism, these GI Jews, as Deborah Dash Moore calls them, were not always treated as equals among their comrades and often found themselves having to prove their loyalty and bravery above and beyond what was expected of their peers. They often had to fight against anti-Semitic stereotypes even within their own ranks. This is something that Gott Stern talked about, like this false and prejudiced idea that Jewish men were physically weak or cowardly. In countless ways, these soldiers demonstrated their resilience, commitment, courage, and patriotism in the face of bigotry. So now that we understand a little bit more about the experience of Jewish American GIs in general, we're now going to take a look at the specific case study of Ritchie Boys like Guy's stuff. Although they were initially seen as outsiders to the US military establishment, they would go ahead and prove their patriotism and skills on the battlefield throughout World War II. So the Ritchie Boys is a term that is used for American soldiers who trained at Camp Ritchie during World War II. Camp Ritchie was in Maryland. At Camp Ritchie, military instructors taught intelligence gathering, collections, and analysis to approximately 20,000 soldiers. The camp was opened on June 19, 1942, and it was inspired by the British Army's approach to intelligence operations and training. Aim of Camp Ritchie was to develop the capacities of interrogators, interpreters, and translators. The motto at the camp, the unofficial motto, was "You must learn from the enemy." Many of the people that would come to train at Camp Ritchie were originally viewed by the US military as the enemy. Like I mentioned, Guy Stern was technically classified as an enemy of the state before he was drafted and naturalized. They were often made to prove their patriotism, as others were not, because of their background. Approximately 2,000 or 10% of these 20,000 soldiers who were trained at Ritchie were German Jewish refugees. Their fluency in German language and knowledge of German customs, traditions, enhanced their intelligence work. Training at Camp Ritchie and serving in the US military created a pathway to citizenship for many refugees. Guy Stern recalled, he says, quote, "In a mass ceremony, dignified and somehow awesome, we became US citizens. I, the outcast from Nazi Germany, had suddenly found a new national identity and simultaneously embraced a fervent new allegiance. It seemed to me then that my perfectly fitting uniform also mirrored my inner attitude. My German citizenship seemed to be a good thing of the past. After all, it had been taken away from me even when I was still living in my home." Many Ritchie Boys joining the military was a way of reclaiming this national identity which had been taken from them in Germany. This created a genuine sense of gratitude and devotion to the United States. Guy Ritchie said it after he was naturalized, and he said it right before he died, of becoming an American citizen was one of the greatest gifts of life. So I had mentioned that 20,000 soldiers are going to go through Camp Ritchie, Maryland. However, just over half, about 11,637, are only going to graduate from this rigorous training. It's a rigorous 8-week-long program. You had to do such things as read and draw accurate maps, learn navigation, how to set up communications equipment. You had to learn Morse code, how to identify enemy weapons, tanks, uniforms, planes, how to dismantle booby traps, how to gather and collect intelligence, learn what enemy force structures and organizations look like. You also had to learn close combat fighting, raids, and searches. So the training was very rigorous, and all of this again had to be done in just an 8-week period. A critical aspect of this training was how to conduct enemy prisoner of war interrogations. The methods that were used by the Ritchie Boys were non-violent and did not include the use of torture. I think a lot of people, when they think about military interrogations, we kind of have war on terror, waterboarding, people up with jumper cables kind of thing. That was not what the Ritchie Boys did. In fact, it was their cultural knowledge and acumen that the Ritchie Boys that made them so effective in gathering intelligence through subtle means. So we're now going to play a clip from Guy Stern's testimony where he describes some of the interrogation techniques that he was taught at Camp Ritchie.
To use 3 spurs to get the prisoner to the door. One of them was what I said before, the superior knowledge, where the prisoner would think, what on earth should I clam up for? They know anything and everything. And sometimes we use information gotten from one prisoner to open up another one. Then the second one was to play buddy with it. And there I sometimes used my knowledge of German soccer and the teams as sort of a conversational gambit to start talking to them And they felt, after a while, they were just talking to another soccer fan, interested in their home team. And that sometimes then led slowly, little by little, to the target of my interrogation. And they didn't feel anymore that they had to be particularly security conscious. There was another one.
So he said there were kind of three techniques there for investigation. First was just this like idea of superior knowledge. Might as well tell us what you already know because we know everything already. The second was getting buddy-buddy with these Nazis, befriending prisoners to diminish their perception of threat. Also not mentioned in this book, another interrogation technique that Guy employed often was playing on the fears of German soldiers. Guy understood, and many of the Ritchie Boys understood that Germans, for instance, were terrified of being captured by Russian soldiers. If they had to be captured, they'd rather be captured by American than Russian soldiers. Germans were kind of, quote, victims of their own propaganda about the brutality of their enemies. They said that the Russians were evil. They painted this terrible caricature of them. And so actually what Guy would do is he would dress up like a Russian soldier. He called himself Sergeant Krugov. And when he came into the room, it was oftentimes when the interrogation was getting nowhere, he would come in dressed in this Russian uniform, and he would say in kind of he would accent his German to make it sound Russian. He would say, okay, time to go with me. You don't want to answer the American questions. Time to come with me. 9 times out of 10, they would start talking. So Guy was very good at this. He was actually decorated with a Bronze Star for his service during the war. The achievements of the Ritchie Boys as a group, in fact, were staggering. The Ritchie Boys were responsible, and this is true, a lot of people don't believe it, but it's very true. The Ritchie Boys were responsible for collecting more than half all of the actionable intelligence that was gathered in Europe during World War II. The historian David Frey argues that they made an essential difference in every single battle during the war. Ritchie Boys fought in both Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Many Ritchie Boys were attached to combat units throughout the war and were present for major operations, including the D-Day landings. The Ritchie Boys also helped to write the Order of Battle of the German Army, which was this comprehensive kind of book that I think Alex talks about more toward the end of the presentation, so I won't steal that thunder from you. Many Ritchie Boys, too, also acted as liberators at concentration camps. They gathered evidence and supported war crimes trials against Nazi perpetrators. In total, about 140 Ritchie Boys lost their lives during the Second World War. In total, the Ritchie Boys earned more than 65 Silver Star medals and numerous Bronze Star medals, as well as at least 5 Legion of Honor medals. Now we're going to have the chance to hear from more testimonies from Ritchie Boys describing their experiences during the Second World War. And for that, I will turn it over to my partner in crime, Alex. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions before we continue? Yeah.
That is a fantastic question. I don't believe so. Believe it or not, I don't believe so.
I do know of two, there were two men who were actually captured at the Battle of the Bulge. And once the Nazis discovered who they were and that they were former German Jews, they were executed pretty much on the spot. There was even another instance where a GI had gone out to go to the restroom in the middle of the night. And because he had this German accent, one of the patrol guards thought that he was a spy and he was shot as he was going to the restroom, unfortunately. Those were the 3 instances that I know about, 2 individuals that were Nazis in the right at that issue. Good question. So the next survivor / Ritchie Boy we're going to take a look at is Paul Fairbrook. He was born in 1923 in Berlin, Germany. Family immigrated to British Palestine in in Israel, essentially. And then shortly after that, he came to the United States, and then in 1943, he is drafted and he's sent to Camp Ritchie. He is assigned to a special secret unit attached to the Pentagon, known only as PO Box 1142. And his job was to interpret documents and that were taken from the German African War, the African Army, in order to analyze their methods of operation. And he, like David mentioned, he helped produce the Red Book. This Red Book was a book that was essentially an index and a dictionary that listed off all these German units, all of their patches, what their patches meant. You know, this patch meant that this unit were snipers, or this patch meant this was, you know, a tank. And so they created this book that was essentially this massive encyclopedia that the Allies were able to use to you know, help with their operations and know who and what they were going up against in the European theater. We have a quote from him.
Well, I told you that the military intelligence research section was given the job of writing the Red Book, which was the name that we gave to the book called the Order of Battle Book of the German Army. And that was a small book, about 250 pages, where the first chapter was to describe the types of units. The second chapter was to describe the officers and where they served. The third one was maybe the SS and the organization of SS. Each of us 18 men, 18 enlisted men, and 3 officers, 3 or 4 officers, plus 1 British officer. Our job was to write this book before we landed in Europe, so that if our interrogators met somebody and that person didn't want to tell us where he was or who he was, the officers would have their book and would be able to tell them.
The purpose of the book was given to American officers before they went to Europe.
Exactly.
So the takeaway from this is the Ritchie Boys served the entire theater. They served everyone. They were trusted to know the German military better than it knew itself in order to save the lives of Allied soldiers and help them succeed in their missions, which will contribute to the victory in Europe. Like he says, our job was to write this book before we landed in Europe, so that if our interrogators met somebody and that person didn't want to tell us where he was or who he was, the officers who had the book and would be able to tell them. Now, about 3 days after the Camp Buchenwald was liberated, Guy Stern, who was our first Ritchie Boy that we examined here, he happened to come across Buchenwald himself. And for the Ritchie Boys that were on the ground in Europe, many would uncover these Nazi concentration camps and the death camps with other Allied soldiers. Liberation was, for these individuals, an unforgettable experience. It was both tied to them as soldiers, but to them as Jewish German individuals. And they came face to face with the aftermath of this genocide and what their families who were still trapped in Europe had to go through. This quote from Guy Stern: "We were walking along and saw these emaciated, horribly looking, close to death people, and so I fell back behind because I didn't want to be seen crying to a hardened soldier. And then he looked around to look where I was, how I was delayed, and he, this good fellow from the middle of Ohio, was bawling just as I was." So this liberation, it impacted all soldiers that witnessed it, but again, Jewish American soldiers could not separate their identities as Jews and soldiers. And for immigrants like Guy, they witnessed what remained of their communities and sometimes even their families. The loss was incredible for them. The next Ritchie Boy we're going to examine is Günter Koss. Günter was born in 1922 in Berlin, Germany. He fled first to Cuba in 1939, and then shortly after, in 1940, he came to the United States. He was drafted in 1943, just like Paul was. And he gained specialized training and was sent to France in 1944. He joined an interrogation team for prisoners of war, and after the war, he translated. He stayed on in Europe and translated, interrogated the Nazi war criminals. Many Ritchie Boys, like Gunter, he stayed in Europe to help with the denazification process, returning Germany to how it was before the Third Reich came into power. And he helped prosecute, like I said, these high-ranking Nazi officials. And assisted in trials against them.
But where it was done, it was very official. We had the, was the major or some lawyer, who was the interrogator. Then we had a transcriber, every word was transcribed. And he would ask the questions. And I would translate the question,
And translate the answers.
and then he would transcribe it, then I would translate the answer. But because of my having lived in Germany, being intimately familiar with it, and when the lawyer asked me a question, which oftentimes it didn't make much sense to me. So I would stop the official, this was like an official, we could stop it, we could talk off screen, so to speak. And I asked in all due respect, sir, what are you trying to get at? And in fact, I conducted the interrogation. Didn't really, but I told him,
Because you know what,
because I know one bit after, why don't you phrase your question such and such and such and such, because then we may get the answer that you can find.
So another takeaway is that the knowledge that these Ritchie boys had went beyond just the language skills that they had, but it also was the cultural skills and the cultural know-how that they had. Germany, it was absolutely essential. Further, Gunther had to push for his expertise to be recognized by his fellow superiors, but he did find opportunities to use his skills to further the mission that the Allies were on. The quote that he just said was living in Germany, being intimately familiar with it, and the lawyer asking a question which it oftentimes didn't make much sense to me. So I would stop the official and I said, all due respect, sir, what are you trying to get at? But in fact, I got the interrogation. Now, Senate Resolution 349, because this entire project that the Ritchie boys were on, they were at the camp, this was all very secret. It's very top secret information. And so a lot of Americans to this day still don't know that the Ritchie boys were created or even existed because it was all held as top secret. And so the Senate resolution here says, whereas because of the roles of the Ritchie boys remain classified for decades, the public generally lacks awareness of their contributions. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Senate, 1, honors the bravery and dedication of the Ritchie boys, 2, recognizes the importance of their contributions to the success of the Allied forces during World War II. It's important for us to learn of these stories and tell them so that the service and sacrifices of these individuals are not forgotten or go unknown. Their experience also gives us the opportunity to reflect on what it means to be an American. This is a quote from Paul Fairbrook. He was the Ritchie boy that I started with. I was proud to be in the American Army, and we were able to do what we had to do. I don't think we're heroes, but the opportunity to help fight and win the war was a wonderful way to serve. I can look anybody straight in their eye and say, I think I've earned the right to be an American, and that's what it's done for me. These men had an immense sense of pride and service to their nation, regardless of the individual obstacles that they faced as being Jewish men, including all of the hatred and prejudice. These Jewish service members fought against anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudices held by the Nazis and even by their own American colonies. And their bravery, honor, and their contributions still live on to this day. Does anybody have a question? Yeah.
Were there any Jewish women that were involved in any of this?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think so.
No. That's a really good question, no. You know,
Not a question, but, I don't know if it was like maybe 2 years ago, 60 Minutes, did a wonderful thing with, interviewing these them.
Yeah.
And as old as they were like close to 100 by the time they did this interview, they were still sharp and funny, and still they had all their knowledge with them.
Guy Stern lived to 101. He passed away in 2023.
23 or 24, and he was working at the Holocaust
Yeah,
Center
he's-
up until his death.
I can still find it on the net somewhere, because it was wonderful.
Yep, it is about 40 minutes long. If you just Google Ritchie Boys, 60 Minutes, it's one of the first thing that pops up. But I think almost all of the individuals in the 60 Minutes, they've either 100 or just under 100. I think Paul Fairbanks lived.
Really worth looking at watching.
Yeah, it's a good one, absolutely.
How did the Ritchie Boys participate in civic thing?
That's a good question. I don't know if they did.
They,
If
so
they
they did.
did, it would have been after the European, people. Do you know?
So they participated in the Pacific as they did in North Africa, as they did in Europe. Now, what specific intelligence they gathered in the Pacific, I could not tell you, but it was a lot of the same work that they did across Europe, across North Africa.
Were the three men that you highlighted here all Michiganders, or were they from across the United States? They were. That's pretty cool.
And 4,000 Holocaust survivors ended up in Michigan.
What was that?
Sorry?
Why was that? I know that we have a very large Jewish population, but it was just particularly within the state of Michigan.
Yeah, great question. A lot of them already had families that were living in Detroit who could sponsor them to come to Detroit specifically, or just to the United States in general. Usually they kind of did it. They never, as far as I recall, not all of them just immediately came to Detroit. There was a lot of like coming to New York first and then hopping to like Cleveland or Detroit, sometimes Canada to Detroit. But that was typically why they and those individuals landed in Detroit was because they had families that could sponsor them. Guaranteed that there was some sort of work that they could contribute to. There was a lot of convincing that had to be done for you people to come in.
The auto industry was also a huge pull for a lot of too. So
And we still living. And be old.
Yeah. Ritchie Boys? I don't know.
it would be,
Guy Stern was about there.
yeah, it would be in the single digits. Because, I mean, even when you talk about Holocaust survivors, many of those survivors that are still alive, they're also in the 90s, 100.
Got about 6 or so that rotate throughout the, they speak every Sunday. Got about 6 or so, I think, that rotate, and they come to speak that on Sunday.
Kind of, so did you say it was one to two?
So the speaker, the Holocaust survivor, they speak from about 12 to 1 on Sundays, and then there's a free public tour that one of our docents does from about 1 to 2. Sometimes the docent is a 2G, what we call a 2G, for next generation survivors, so grandchild or child of a Holocaust survivor.
If you're gonna visit, I recommend doing it on Sunday, just because you would get to listen to a survivor and you have the free public tour too.
Yeah.
If there are no more questions, thank you all so much for being here today, for learning about this very important piece of World War II history. Me and Alex will stay behind for a couple minutes. If anybody has any questions relating to the presentation, relating to the work we do at the Holocaust Center, more than happy to talk to you.
Great questions. No, that's very,